On a crystalline February morning in 1982, Patricia Walsh knelt on the subway platform at Union Station in Washington, D.C., retrieving the scattered contents of her purse that had spilled when a commuter's briefcase collided with her shoulder during the morning rush. Lipstick, compact mirror, house keys, loose change, all the mundane debris of daily life clattered across the grimy tiles as hundreds of feet shuffled past in the eternal hurry that defined the nation's capital. She was gathering these items with the practiced efficiency of someone perpetually late for work, thinking only of the meeting she had in 37 minutes at the State Department, where she worked as a protocol officer. She had absolutely no reason to believe that the burgundy passport booklet she spotted wedged against the yellow warning strip at the platform edge would lead her into the shadowy world of Cold War espionage and transform her from an anonymous bureaucrat into an unwitting participant in one of the most significant counterintelligence operations of the decade. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Patricia Walsh was 34 years old that winter, a career civil servant who had worked her way up from clerical positions to become a mid-level protocol officer responsible for coordinating logistics for visiting foreign dignitaries. She had grown up in Baltimore, attended Georgetown University on a partial scholarship, and joined the State Department fresh out of college with idealistic notions about public service and international relations. 12 years later, those notions had been tempered by the grinding reality of bureaucratic work, endless meetings, and the careful political navigation required to survive in government employment. Her job involved arranging hotel accommodations, coordinating motorcade routes, ensuring proper flag placement at ceremonial events, the kind of work that was essential but invisible, noticed only when something went wrong. Patricia lived alone in a small apartment in Arlington, Virginia, just across the Potomac River from D.C. She had been engaged once to a law student she met during her senior year at Georgetown, but the relationship had dissolved under the pressure of competing career ambitions and the realization that they wanted fundamentally different lives. Since then, she had dated occasionally, but without much enthusiasm, finding that most men were either intimidated by her government position or dismissed it as glorified secretarial work. She had settled into a comfortable routine: her work, her small circle of friends, her weekend ritual of browsing the bookstores on Connecticut Avenue, her quiet evenings reading mystery novels while classical music played on her stereo. The passport she spotted on the subway platform was distinctive, not the familiar navy blue of American passports, but a deep burgundy red that immediately caught her eye. She picked it up carefully, noting its weight and the embossed gold lettering on the cover. Cyrillic letters she could not read, but the hammer and sickle symbol was unmistakable. This was a Soviet passport, and finding one on a Washington subway platform during the height of Cold War tensions was unusual enough to warrant attention. Patricia stood up, the passport in her hand, and looked around the platform. The morning crowd continued to flow past her, faces buried in newspapers, eyes glazed with the stupor of routine commutes. No one seemed to be searching frantically for a lost document. No one appeared distressed or concerned. She moved to the side of the platform, away from the edge, and opened the passport to examine its contents. Her Russian language skills were limited to the basics she had picked up during a semester-long course in Tsuan College, but she could make out enough to understand the essential information. The passport belonged to someone named Dmitry Volkov, issued in Moscow in 1979. The photograph showed a man in his early 40s with dark hair, sharp features, and the kind of neutral expression typical of official documents. The passport contained multiple entry and exit stamps from various countries, the visa pages nearly full, suggesting someone who traveled extensively. Patricia flipped through the pages, noting stamps from France, West Germany, Austria, and multiple entries into the United States, the most recent dated just 3 days ago. Her first instinct was to turn the passport into the Metro Transit Authority's Lost and Found office, the standard procedure for any item discovered on public transportation. But something made her hesitate, a nagging sense that a Soviet passport found on a Washington subway platform deserved more careful handling than a forgotten umbrella or a misplaced wallet. Cold War might have been a distant abstraction for most Americans going about their daily lives, but Patricia worked at the State Department. She dealt with foreign dignitaries regularly, and she understood that Soviet citizens traveling in the United States were carefully monitored by both their own government and American intelligence agencies. She made a decision. Instead of turning the passport into transit authorities, she would take it to the State Department's security office and let them determine the appropriate course of action. It was probably nothing, probably just an unfortunate tourist who would be frantically searching for his lost document, but better to err on the side of caution when it came to Soviet nationals in the nation's capital. Patricia slipped the passport into her purse and boarded the next train. The ride to her stop took 17 minutes, during which she found herself repeatedly touching her purse to confirm the passport was still there, as though it might somehow disappear or transform into something else. She felt an odd mixture of responsibility and unease, the sensation of carrying something that did not belong to her, something that might be more significant than it appeared. When she arrived at the State Department building, a massive beige structure that occupied several blocks of Washington's Foggy Bottom neighborhood, Patricia went directly to the security office instead of heading to her own desk on the 4th floor. The security office was located in the basement, a warren of small rooms staffed by serious men and women who dealt with everything from background checks to threat assessments. She approached the front desk, where a uniformed security officer named Carl Morrison sat reading a report, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Patricia explained what she had found and produced the passport from her purse. Morrison's expression shifted from mild interest to sharp attention the moment he saw the burgundy cover and the Cyrillic lettering. He asked her to wait while he consulted with his supervisor, and Patricia found herself sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair in a hallway that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, wondering if she had overreacted by bringing the passport here instead of simply turning it into the metro. 15 minutes later, Morrison returned with a senior security officer named James Keller, a man in his early 50s with gray hair and the kind of steady, evaluating gaze that made Patricia feel as though she were being assessed and catalogued. Keller introduced himself politely and asked Patricia to accompany him to a private office where they could discuss the matter more thoroughly. The office was small and windowless, furnished with a metal desk, 3 chairs, and filing cabinets that lined one wall. Keller sat behind the desk and gestured for Patricia to sit across from him. He had the passport open in front of him and was examining it with the careful attention of someone who knew exactly what to look for. "Miss Walsh," Keller said, his voice calm and professional. "Can you walk me through exactly where and when you found this passport? What were the circumstances?" Patricia provided a detailed account of the morning's events, the collision on the subway platform, her scattered purse, the passport wedged against the warning strip. Keller listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper. When she finished, he asked if she had seen anyone on the platform who appeared to be searching for something, anyone who looked distressed or concerned. "No," Patricia said. "Everyone was just rushing to catch their trains. Nobody seemed to notice me picking up my things. Keller nodded slowly, still studying the passport. Did you recognize the name Dmitry Volkov before you found this passport? Has that name appeared in any of your protocol work? No, Patricia replied. Should I recognize it? Keller closed the passport and leaned back in his chair. Dmitry Volkov is registered with our office as a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy. He's been in Washington for approximately 18 months. Finding his passport on a subway platform is unusual for several reasons. First, Soviet diplomatic personnel are generally very careful with their documents, particularly passports. Second, cultural attaches often have, shall we say, additional responsibilities beyond cultural affairs. Third, the location where you found this passport is interesting, given that it's not on a direct route between the Soviet embassy and any obvious destination a cultural attaché would visit. Patricia felt a chill run through her. Are you saying he's a spy? Keller smiled slightly, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. I'm saying that Soviet cultural attaches sometimes engage in activities beyond organizing ballet performances and art exhibitions. Whether Dmitry Volkov is one of those individuals is not something I can discuss with you. What I can tell you is that you did the right thing by bringing this passport to us, instead of the transit authority. Keller stood up, indicating the meeting was over. We'll take it from here, Miss Walsh. I'll need you to sign a brief statement documenting where and when you found the passport, and then I'd appreciate it if you didn't discuss this matter with anyone. Can I count on your discretion? Of course, Patricia said, though she felt vaguely disappointed that her small adventure seemed to be ending so quickly and anticlimactically. But as Patricia returned to her fourth-floor office and settled into the routine of her workday, answering phones and reviewing schedule proposals for an upcoming visit by the Belgian foreign minister, she could not stop thinking about the burgundy passport and the man in the photograph. What kind of person lost their passport on a subway platform? Had it been stolen? Had Volkov been the victim of a crime, or was there some other explanation for why such an important document would end up wedged against the warning strip at Union Station? 3 days later, Patricia received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end identified himself as Special Agent Robert Driscoll from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He explained that he was investigating certain matters related to the passport she had found, and wondered if she would be willing to meet with him to answer a few additional questions. Patricia felt her pulse quicken, a mixture of anxiety and excitement. She agreed to meet him that afternoon at a coffee shop several blocks from the State Department. Driscoll was a man in his late 30s, with sandy brown hair and the kind of forgettable face that would blend into any crowd. He wore a conservative gray suit and carried a leather briefcase that looked well used. When Patricia arrived at the coffee shop, he was already seated at a corner table, 2 cups of coffee waiting. He stood as she approached and shook her hand with a firm grip. Miss Walsh, thank you for meeting with me, Driscoll said. I know this is unusual, and I appreciate your cooperation. They sat down, and Driscoll pulled a small notebook from his briefcase. I want to go over the details of how you found Dmitry Volkov's passport one more time. I know you've already given a statement to State Department security, but I need to hear it directly from you. Sometimes people remember additional details when they have time to think about an incident. Patricia walked through the story again, trying to recall every detail she could. Driscoll listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh something in his mind. Miss Walsh, what I'm about to tell you is sensitive information. I'm sharing it with you because we may need your assistance, and you have a right to understand why. Can I trust that this conversation will remain confidential? Yes, Patricia said, leaning forward. Slightly. Driscoll took a sip of his coffee. Dmitry Volkov is not simply a cultural attaché. We've been monitoring him for several months because we believe he's an intelligence officer with the KGB operating under diplomatic cover. The problem is that we haven't been able to gather enough evidence to justify taking action against him. He's been very careful, very professional. The fact that his passport turned up on a subway platform struck us as extremely odd, because Soviet intelligence officers don't simply lose their documents. Patricia felt her stomach tighten. So how did it get there? That's what we're trying to determine, Driscoll said. There are several possibilities. It could have been stolen from him, though he hasn't reported it stolen to either Soviet embassy security or local police. It could have been deliberately planted, though we can't figure out why anyone would do that. Or, and this is what concerns us most, it could be part of some operation we don't understand yet. Patricia tried to process this information. What does any of this have to do with me? I just found it and turned it in. Driscoll nodded. And that's probably all it is. A fortunate coincidence that gave us an opportunity. But I need to ask you something that might seem strange. In the days since you found the passport, have you noticed anything unusual? Anyone following you? Unfamiliar cars parked near your home? Phone calls where no one speaks? Patricia felt a spike of fear. No, nothing like that. Why would anyone follow me? Probably they wouldn't, Driscoll said quickly. But we need to consider all possibilities. The KGB is very sophisticated. If they suspected that Volkov's passport had been found by someone with State Department credentials, they might want to know more about that person. Over the next several minutes, Driscoll explained the basics of what the FBI knew about Dmitry Volkov. He had arrived in Washington 18 months earlier with impressive cultural credentials, having worked in the Soviet Ministry of Culture, organizing international exhibitions. His cover was solid, his behavior had been unremarkable, attending the expected social functions, meeting with American cultural organizations, arranging for Soviet musical groups to tour the United States. But the FBI had received intelligence from a source they would not identify that suggested Volkov was actually a KGB officer tasked with recruiting American assets, identifying government employees or contractors who might be vulnerable to compromise. The passport you found contained something interesting, Driscoll continued. Our technical people examined it very carefully. They discovered that one of the pages, the one with his photograph, had been very slightly modified. The photograph itself is genuine, but the substrate beneath it contains a thin layer of microfilm. Patricia's eyes widened. Microfilm? Like in spy movies? Exactly like in spy movies, Driscoll said with a slight smile. The sun. Microfilm contains what appears to be a list of names. Codenames, actually, along with some numbers that might be phone numbers or account numbers. We're still analyzing it, but it suggests that Volkov was using his passport as a way to transport intelligence information, probably because he knew that if he were ever searched, a passport would be examined less thoroughly than other items. So when he lost the passport, Patricia said slowly, he lost more than just his travel document. He lost classified information. Precisely. And that's why we're very interested in how and why he lost it. Was it carelessness? Was it stolen by a rival intelligence service? Did he deliberately abandon it for some reason we don't understand? These are questions we need to answer. Driscoll leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. Miss Walsh, I'm going to ask you to do something that might make you uncomfortable. We're going to return Volkov's passport to the Soviet embassy, claiming it was found and turned in to the Metro Transit Authority. When we return it, we want to observe Volkov's reaction, see how he behaves, who he contacts, whether he shows signs of panic or relief. And we'd like you to be the one who returns it. Patricia felt her mouth go dry. Why me? Because you work in protocol at the State Department. It would be completely normal for someone in your position to handle the return of a lost diplomatic passport. You can call the Soviet embassy, explain that the passport was found and turned in, and arrange to return it personally. It gives us an opportunity to observe the interaction, and it might reveal something useful about Volkov's current state of mind. "I'm not trained for this," Patricia said, her voice wavering slightly. "I process visa applications and coordinate motorcade routes. I'm not a spy." "You wouldn't be spying," Driscoll assured her. "You'd simply be returning lost property in your official capacity. We'll brief you on what to look for, how to read certain behavioral cues, but mainly we just need you to act naturally and report back on the interaction." Patricia sat in silence, her coffee growing cold in front of her. Part of her wanted to refuse, to maintain the comfortable boundaries of her ordinary life. But another part of her, perhaps the part that had been bored and restless for years, felt a surge of something she had not experienced in a long time, the sense that she might matter, that her actions could contribute to something larger than scheduling conferences and ordering flowers for reception halls. "I'll do it," she heard herself say. Over the next 2 days, Patricia underwent a crash course in observation techniques. FBI agents trained her to notice small details, micro-expressions that might reveal stress or deception, the way people held their bodies, the unconscious gestures that indicated nervousness or relief. They taught her how to mentally photograph a room, to catalog who was present and how they reacted. They emphasized that she should not try to be clever or extract information. Simply observe and remember. On a Thursday afternoon, Patricia made the phone call to the Soviet embassy. She identified herself as Patricia Walsh from the State Department's protocol office and explained that a Soviet passport belonging to Dmitry Volkov had been recovered and turned in to authorities. She could return it at the embassy's convenience. The woman who answered the phone, speaking English with a heavy accent, seemed surprised and asked Patricia to hold. After a pause that stretched nearly 3 minutes, a male voice came on the line. "This is Dmitry Volkov," the voice said, speaking careful English. "You have found my passport?" "Yes, Mr. Volkov," Patricia replied, keeping her voice professional. "It was turned in to Metro Transit Authority, and they forwarded it to us. I can bring it to the embassy tomorrow afternoon if that's convenient." There was a pause, and Patricia could hear what sounded like muffled conversation in the background. "Yes," Volkov finally said. "Tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Please ask for me at the gate." Patricia hung up and immediately called Driscoll to report the conversation. He sounded pleased, noting that Volkov had taken the call himself rather than having subordinates handle it, suggesting the passport's recovery was important enough to warrant his personal attention. The next afternoon, Patricia dressed carefully in a conservative navy suit and pulled her dark hair back in a neat bun, the professional armor she wore for official meetings. She carried the passport in a sealed State Department envelope, and as she walked toward the Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue, she was acutely aware of the FBI surveillance team that was somewhere nearby, watching and recording. The Soviet embassy was a gray stone building that occupied an entire block, surrounded by a high fence and guarded by serious-looking men in dark suits. Patricia approached the gate and explained her purpose to the guard, who made a phone call before allowing her to enter. She was escorted through a metal detector and into a stark reception area, where she waited for 10 minutes that felt like an hour. When Dmitry Volkov finally appeared, Patricia recognized him immediately from his passport photograph, though in person he seemed somehow more substantial, more present. He wore a well-tailored dark suit and moved with the careful posture of someone conscious of being watched. His eyes, pale blue and very alert, met Patricia's with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Miss Walsh," Volkov said, extending his hand. Thank you for taking the time to return my passport. This is very kind of you. His English was excellent, with only the slightest accent. Patricia shook his hand, noting that his palm was slightly damp, and handed him the envelope containing the passport. We're always happy to assist diplomatic personnel, she said, using the formal language Driscoll had coached her to. Employ. Volkov opened the envelope and examined the passport carefully, flipping through each page with meticulous attention. Patricia watched his face, looking for the micro-expressions she had been trained to recognize. For just a moment, when he reached the page with his photograph, she saw something flicker across his features. Relief, perhaps, or maybe concern. It was gone so quickly she could not be certain she had seen anything at all. Where was it found? Volkov asked, still studying the passport. At Union Station, on the subway platform, Patricia replied. A commuter turned it into the transit authority. Volkov looked up, his pale eyes fixing on Patricia's face. A commuter? Do you know who? No, I'm afraid not, Patricia said. The person wished to remain anonymous. Another pause, another flicker of something in Volkov's expression. I must have dropped it rushing to catch a train. Very careless of me. I am grateful it was found by an honest person. The conversation continued for another minute, polite platitudes about the reliability of American citizens and the importance of international cooperation. But Patricia had the distinct impression that Volkov was studying her as carefully as she was studying him, assessing whether she was simply a protocol officer doing her job or something more. When Patricia finally left the embassy and walked back down Wisconsin Avenue, she felt her hands trembling slightly. She had done nothing dangerous, nothing remotely dramatic, yet she felt as though she had crossed some invisible threshold into a world she had only read about in novels. She met Driscoll that evening at the same coffee shop. He listened to her account of the meeting with Volkov, asking detailed questions about the man's reactions and demeanor. You did very well, Driscoll said when she finished. Volkov's behavior was consistent with someone who was relieved to recover the passport, but also concerned about what might have been discovered. The fact that he asked about who found it suggests he's worried about whether the microfilm was detected. So what happens now? Patricia asked. Now we watch him very carefully, Driscoll replied. We see if he changes his patterns, who he contacts, whether he shows signs of panic. The passport's recovery might make him feel secure enough to resume whatever operations he had suspended, or it might make him so nervous that he makes mistakes. Over the following weeks, Patricia returned to her normal routine, but found that normal no longer felt quite the same. She could not stop thinking about Dmitry Volkov and the microfilm hidden in his passport. She wondered what the names on that list meant, whose lives might be affected by the intelligence it contained. Driscoll called her occasionally with updates, always carefully vague about specifics, but she gathered that the FBI's surveillance of Volkov had intensified. 2 months after Patricia had returned the passport, Driscoll called her with news. The FBI had arrested Dmitry Volkov, along with 3 American citizens who appeared on the list hidden in his passport. The Americans, 2 Defense Department contractors, and a National Security Agency analyst had been selling classified information to the Soviets for years. Volkov had been their handler, coordinating dead drops and payments, and the list Patricia had inadvertently discovered had provided the breakthrough that exposed the entire network. Your find on that subway platform may have prevented significant intelligence losses, Driscoll told her. We estimate that the information these individuals compromised affected everything from weapons systems development to signals intelligence operations. Stopping them probably saved lives. Patricia absorbed this information with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. She had stumbled into something significant, but she had not really done anything heroic. She had simply picked up a passport and made a phone call. But Driscoll had a different perspective. Most intelligence work isn't dramatic, Miss Walsh. It's patient observation, careful analysis, connecting small pieces of information that don't seem related. You found something unusual, recognized it deserved attention, and brought it to people who could act on it. That's exactly what good citizenship looks like during a Cold War. The case remained largely classified. Patricia was forbidden from discussing it with anyone outside a small circle of security-cleared officials. Volkov was declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States, returning to Moscow, where his fate remained unknown. The 3 American traitors were prosecuted in closed trials and received lengthy prison sentences. Patricia received a letter of commendation from the State Department, carefully worded to avoid specifics, acknowledging her alertness and discretion in handling sensitive materials. The letter was signed by the Assistant Secretary for Security and placed in her personnel file, where it would quietly influence her career trajectory for years to come. But the most significant change was internal. Patricia had discovered something about herself during those weeks of involvement in the Volkov case. She possessed capabilities she had never recognized, an attention to detail, a capacity for discretion, a willingness to step outside comfortable routines when circumstances demanded it. These were qualities that the State Department's Security Division valued highly. 6 months after the Volkov arrest, Patricia was offered a position in the department's Office of Diplomatic Security, a job that would involve considerably more than coordinating motorcade routes. She accepted without hesitation, beginning a second career that would span 2 decades and take her to countries around the world, always in service of protecting American diplomats and uncovering threats to national security. Years later, after the Cold War had ended and the Soviet Union had collapsed, Patricia would sometimes think about that February morning on the subway platform. She would remember kneeling to gather her scattered belongings, spotting the burgundy passport, making the decision to take it seriously rather than simply turning it in to the transit lost and found. Such a small decision, yet it had changed everything for her, and in ways she would never fully know, had perhaps changed outcomes in the shadowy war between superpowers. The passport itself, that thin burgundy booklet with its hidden microfilm, eventually ended up in an FBI training facility, displayed in a case alongside other artifacts of Cold War espionage. Instructors would point to it when teaching new agents about the importance of paying attention to details, about how seemingly insignificant discoveries could unravel entire intelligence operations. They would tell the story of a State Department protocol officer who found a lost passport and had the instinct to recognize it as something more than ordinary lost property. But they rarely mentioned Patricia by name. She preferred it that way, preferred to work in the background, observing and protecting, part of the vast, quiet machinery that kept American diplomats safe and American secrets secure. The woman who had once measured her life in scheduled meetings and coordinated receptions had discovered a deeper purpose, all because she had paid attention when it mattered and trusted her instincts when something seemed not quite right. The Cold War taught many lessons, but perhaps one of the most important was this: that vigilance required no special training, only awareness and willingness to act. That ordinary citizens going about their ordinary lives could, through simple alertness and civic responsibility, contribute to their nation's security in ways they might never fully understand. Patricia Walsh embodied that truth, proving that sometimes the most sophisticated espionage operations could be disrupted by someone who simply noticed something out of place and cared enough to pursue it. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.